We're making it through the snowstorm, the budding snowstorm that we have going outside. Once again, I want to thank Beth Emeth for hosting and Ron Becker for dedicating the series. If people have phones that they could put on silent, that would be great. And I want to make sure to mention, you should have received an email a couple of days ago about our next series. I believe I sent it out or maybe it was yesterday. Could be it was yesterday. It's been a long day. The next series is by Rabbi Jonathan Ziering, and it's The Exodus in Hollywood. There you go. There's the flyer. And it should be a lot of fun. He's going to be looking at a few different movies, the aspects of what they depict from the story of Egypt, the departure from Egypt, and so on, and what they say that fits the psukim, the verses themselves, what they say that fits Midrash, and what they say that seems to have just been, sort of thrown in. Looking at clips from the movies themselves. That should be a lot of fun. Please make sure to register. But we have week 4 of our series, Game of Thrones, the Persian Empire edition. Once again, not an endorsement of the series in any way, shape, or form. I have never seen it. They are not endorsing me either. But as I put at the top of your sheet, the list of the 4 kings we've been looking at, and this week we're looking at King Artachshasta. We had Darius the Mede, who was railroaded by his deputies, assistants, whatever you want to call them, satraps, who he wanted to have layers of hierarchy in running the kingdom, and they told him, you're better off, at least for a month, that everybody should come to you, as a means of snaring Daniel. And he ends up in the lion's den, and he's fine. They end up in the lion's den, and they're not fine. Then you have the story of Cyrus the Great, who believes, it seems, that he is carrying out a practice of realpolitik. He's sort of, his interests converge with those of the empires he has conquered when he says, you can go back to your land, and I'm going to even endorse the construction of your temple. I am your God's anointed one. He's being a smart conqueror. It's his own strategy. Nonetheless, from the perspective of Tanakh, he's actually being manipulated by God into doing this, so that he will send the Jews back to build the temple right on schedule for their redemption. We're going to come back to that story later on. But then we had Ahasuerus the anxious, the king who is afraid, and how all the events around him are manipulated to play on that fear, first to get him to attack the Jews, first to get him to get rid of Vashti, putting Esther in place, then getting him to attack the Jews, then getting him to suspect Haman, all the way through, leading to our rescue. And this week we get to King Artachshasta. And as I wrote on the sheet, sometimes a king is good, ? Meaning, one of the things we have to ask is, do we believe that there are nice guys on the throne of non-Jewish empires? Is it possible for Tanakh to recognize a non-Jewish king as good, not because he got manipulated, not just because God made him do it, and not because of self-interest, just because he's a good guy? And that's what we're going to see in our discussion. And I brought you source number 1 because I had to. The article, Meet the Group of Right-Wing Christians Who Believe President Trump Was Chosen by God. Trump's arguably unchristian history of alleged sexual assault and harassment, questionable business dealings, multiple marriages, and general vulgarity are of little apparent consequence to POTUS Shield, which is an evangelical group. POTUS stands for President of the United States, since God put his favor on him. Recently, however, it seems POTUS Shield and other conservative Christians found a way to make Trump palatable to those less zealous among them. Trump is just a means to an end. Trump as president, right-wing evangelicals suggest, is akin to a latter-day Constantine. Constantine was the initially non-believing Roman emperor who nevertheless converted the Roman Empire to Christianity. Viewed through this lens, Trump is still a tool of God and washed clean of his obvious sins. In other words, the philosophy that they're putting forth is, he's a bad guy, but God is going to use him to do good things. So the question that I have is, we have seen Tanakh view non-Jewish kings as manipulated by God in the manner that they're describing, but again, can we believe that not Trump, he's not in the conversation and shall not be, referenced later on, but in general, could you believe that a non-Jewish political leader might just be good on his own? And if we believe, this is the other question here, which was asked back in week 2, if we believe that God manipulates kings, what does that do to the doctrine of free will? What happens to their ability to make their own decisions? And that's not something I meant to tackle when we started the series, I must confess. Meaning, when I planned this series way back when, I thought, we're going to have a good time learning some of these stories that people are less familiar with, more familiar with. These are important events in Jewish history. I saw it as sort of a shifting of gears, because the previous series on mental health was very philosophy-oriented, so now we'll talk about Tanakh. But the truth of the matter is it comes right back to philosophy, because you can't really do it without discussing the question of free will. And the more I looked at these stories, the more I realized there actually is an answer, and particularly so in the story of King Artachshasta. So that's why I hope to go with this. Sorry?
The same as with Bilam.
Oh yeah. The same as with Bilam, and it'll fit very well with Bilam's story too, and various other stories. Paro will fit this as well, for that matter. We're not talking about Paro now, that's the next series, but it'll fit with him as well, you're correct. So the first problem that you have to address in order to get anywhere with this is the oddly grammatically correct title of my next section on the sheet. How many kings is Artachshasta? Right? It doesn't sound like a proper sentence, but it is. You see, Artachshasta is a name used in Tanakh, specifically the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, for a king of the Persian Empire. Some historians identify him with a king whose name is usually written Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, specifically Artaxerxes the First, because we know of at least 3, I don't know how to pluralize that name, Artaxerxes or something. But this one, Artaxerxes the First, reigns from 465 before the Common Era to 424 before the Common Era, if you use the secular historical count. That puts him more than 70 years after Cyrus has allowed the Jews to return to Israel and to build their temple. Again, using the secular historical chronology. There is a passage in the Talmud which seems to disagree and put Artachshasta earlier, right after the temple is rebuilt. But we're not going into that conversation. We will see King Artachshasta show up in 4 different stories. And the question is this the same person, covering a very long period of time? Or are there multiple kings who are being called Artachshasta in the account in Tanakh? Keeping in mind that, again, this is a name that shows up repeatedly in the list of Persian kings from this era. One challenge, for example, is that in the 4th chapter of Ezra, which we're going to read shortly, he reigns before the time of King Darius. And we'll see that very clearly. On the other hand, if you take a look at source number 2, you're going to find the description of the completion of the construction of the temple in Jerusalem under the aegis of the God of Israel and by the order of Cyrus and Darius and King Artaxerxes of Persia. Sounds like he's after Darius. So I have one story that puts him before Darius, another one that puts him after Darius, and the answer may be these are different Artaxerxes. These are different Artachshastim, if you will. You can do what you like with it, yeah.
Not to be confused with Xerxes.
Correct. Xerxes is Koresh, is Cyrus. Xerxes, Cyrus, and Koresh are generally treated as being the same person. That's a good point. So there are multiple solutions to this problem, and I don't want to dwell on it because we have so much more to see, but you have to at least acknowledge the issue. The Talmud's response to the problem of these Artachshastas showing up over a very long period of time, and sometimes before Darius, sometimes after Darius, is what you see in source number 3. It was taught, Cyrus is Darius, is Artachshasta. One guy. Cyrus, because he was a kosher king, because the name Cyrus in Hebrew is Koresh. So Koresh, kosher. There are other associations between the words that I'm not going to go into right now, but Koresh and kosher, because he was a good king. We like him. Artachshasta, because of his empire, meaning that was the throne name, like Pharaoh. It's an inherited title. And Darius is his real name. That's what his mother called him, was Darius. That's one approach. I should note that doesn't actually mean that it's all one person. The simple read of the text in the Talmud is that what it's saying is that Darius was his name. He was nicknamed Cyrus because he was a good king, and we liked the original Cyrus. In other words, it's not claiming that everything we're going to read about today was all done by one man from the beginning of the return of the Jews to their land all the way through the construction of the temple and so on. But rather, there was a great king named Cyrus. He allowed us to go back to our land. We liked him. Later on, there was a king named Darius, who was known as Artachshasta because that was the name that you gave kings. And the Jews nicknamed him Cyrus because his deeds were so good. They reminded them of the good Cyrus. That's the standard explanation of this passage in the Talmud. There are other takes, but that's the standard read. On the other hand, in source number 4, you find Rabbi Zrachia Halevi in the Middle Ages, who says, the Talmud says that, but I have a simple read of the sentence and of the passages in the book of Ezra, and what he ends up floating is the idea that there are different kings, including multiple kings named Artachshasta. So he has Cyrus, then Artachshasta, then Darius, then another Artachshasta, and that's the way that he reads it in number 4. For our purposes, we will be looking at 4 stories involving Persian kings. 3 of them will be named Artachshasta in the story itself. One of them will be named Darius in the story, but we think this is also an Artachshasta of some kind. The question of how it connects to the Persian record doesn't matter. Our question is fundamentally this. In 3 of the 4 stories, King Artachshasta is going to do things that we like very much. One of them not so much. But in 3 out of the 4, he's going to do things we like very much. And what we want to know is how to perceive his actions based on the questions that I asked in the beginning. So I realize that the whole run-through of multiple kings, having multiple kings and too few names to go around is somewhat confusing, and I just threw it in like 6 minutes, and I understand that it's probably not entirely clear. But what I want to get across, if you read the text, you'll see it'll become hopefully more clear. But what I want to get across is, we will use this name Artachshasta to refer to one king or multiple kings who are going under the same banner. But the stories in Tanakh really do seem to describe him as one person. He will also occasionally be referred to as Darius, but again, likely the same person. Are we clear on that? Like mud. Okay. Let's see how it goes. I hope that preface, didn't only confuse, but let's see. We'll see as this plays out. So we're going to see these 4 stories. The record of King Artachshasta, whether he is called Artachshasta or doing business under the name Darius. And we're going to get a sense of who this person is through the course of the 4 stories. I'm not adding a lot of material on each of the stories because we have so much to see just in terms of text. So the first appearance, all of these translations here are the JPS 1985 edition. I didn't do a retranslation. So the first story comes from the 4th chapter of the book of Ezra. This is at the point when the Jews have returned to Israel by Cyrus's permission. And in this story, it seems that they are building the temple, they're building the Beit HaMikdash. That's what was happening right before this. But the Samaritans are angry. The Samaritans were originally representatives of various nations who were moved into Samaria, the region north of Jerusalem. When the 10 tribes were exiled by the Assyrians, the Assyrian method of conquest, we talked about this last week, was to transfer populations. Good way to avoid revolution if the people there don't have roots locally and don't feel like it's our land to fight for. So the Assyrians move out the 10 tribes, and they bring in a collection of various nations, not Jewish, no association with the land, and they come into the land. They become known as Samaritans because their center is in the Shomron. Their capital is Shomron. Samaria. So originally they're there and doing their thing. And as Tanakh describes it, they start to experience attacks by lions. And they decide that the problem is we're practicing idolatry, and this is the land of the Jewish God. And so they get Kohanim, Jewish priests, imported to teach them how to practice Judaism. And the Talmud has a whole discussion. Did they convert to Judaism? Did they not convert to Judaism? What's very clear is they view themselves as quasi-Jewish. The Jews now come back to the land and start to build a temple. The Samaritans come to Zerubbabel, who is the leader of this enterprise, and they say to him, let's build together. And Zerubbabel says, let's not. Absolutely not. It is not for you to build with us. Different explanations for why he refuses. Whether it's because he felt they wanted to make this a multiplex. Right? They wanted it to be, here's the Jewish temple here, and here's a temple for Baal there, and it'll all be one big temple for multiple gods, and that's what he was opposed to. Or whether it was because he felt they were just trying to sabotage the enterprise entirely. They wanted to destroy everything, and they figured, well, pretend that we're part of this in order to put a stop to it. Either way, he rejects their offer. Well, they're not happy. And they tried different tactics to prevent the construction. And this is what they did as one of their tactics. They wrote a way to Persian headquarters. Take a look at source number 5, please. And in the time of Artaxerxes, Artachshasta, Bishlam, Mithridat, and Tavel, and the rest of their colleagues wrote to King Artaxerxes of Persia a letter written in Aramaic and translated in Aramaic. And here goes their letter. Rechum the commissioner and Shimshai the scribe wrote a letter concerning Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes as follows. There are 2 levels in the hierarchy because these people, the first group, Bishlam, Mithridat, and Tavel, are of the Samaritan leadership. And they bribe the agents of the Persian Empire, Rechum and Shimshai, to send the following communication back to the Persian king. To King Artaxerxes from your servants, men of the province beyond the river. That's Abar Nahara is the name for this region. And now be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us, the Jews who came back out of exile, have reached Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are completing the walls and repairing the foundation. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls completed, they will not pay tribute, poll tax, or land tax. And in the end it will harm the kingdom. Now since we eat the salt of the palace, meaning we benefit from the largesse of the king, and it is not right that we should see the king dishonored, we have written to advise the king of this, so that you may search the records of your fathers and find in the records, and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and states. Sedition has been rife in it from early times. On that account this city was destroyed. We advise the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, you will no longer have any portion in the province beyond the river. That's their charge. The Jews rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, are going to rebel against you. They're not going to pay your taxes, and they will become autonomous. Question: are they right, the Samaritans? Given our history, we may not like it, but you have to be honest. If you look in the records of Jerusalem, this is precisely what you will find to be the case. This is what we do. So, as much as I'm angry at them, I have to admit that this is so. However, there may be a lie in here anyway, depending on when this story took place. I just told you that this story takes place as we're building the temple. We're not building the walls of Jerusalem at all. So there are 2 different ways to attack this story. One way to attack the story is simply they lied. And that was what they had to bribe the scribes to send, is this message that indicates the Jews are building the wall. Alternatively, this story actually took place later in Ezra and Nehemiah, because in context where it appears, they're talking about how the Samaritans made efforts to stop us. It could be they imported a story that happened later on in history. It doesn't matter for our purposes. What does matter for our purposes is they wrote away to headquarters at some point with this story about the Jews building the wall saying that once we have our wall built, we are going to rebel. So we flip the page. The king sent back the following message. To Rechum the commissioner and Shimshai the scribe and the rest of their colleagues who dwell in Samaria and in the rest of the province of beyond the river. Greeting.
We would identify as.
That's where we were. Beyond the river means beyond the Euphrates is usually the way it's taken. I originally, when I first read this, thought it was beyond the Jordan. But it's not. It seems to be beyond the Euphrates. Right, as is Jerusalem. But it's part of a larger region. That seems to be the idea. Now the letter that you wrote me has been read to me in translation. At my order a search has been made, and it has been found that this city has from earliest times risen against kings, and that rebellion and sedition have been rife in it. Powerful kings have ruled over Jerusalem and exercised authority over the whole province of beyond the river, and tribute, poll tax, and land tax were paid to them. Now issue an order to stop these men. This city is not to be rebuilt until I so order. Take care not to be lax in this matter, or there will be much damage and harm to the kingdom. So he buys the story. When the text of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read before Rechum and Shimshai the scribe and their colleagues, they hurried to Jerusalem to the Jews and stopped them by main force. They hurry to take care of this because in general when the Persian king says do something, that's what you do, is you hurry. So that's your first story. That's the story that we don't like in terms of what Artachshasta did. Even as we understand why he would do it, right? He stops the construction of either the temple or the walls of Jerusalem, again, depending on when this story took place. Are we clear on the basic narrative? Okay. That brings us to the second story. The second story is the one where he's going to go under the name Darius instead. But again, the Talmud believes it's the same person. This story appears only a couple of chapters later in the book of Ezra. By the way, I'm going to send out a link later if I remember. I've been teaching the books of Ezra and Nehemiah at Shari Shamayim on Tuesdays for the last year and a half or so. And the recordings are all online. So I'll send you a link where you can get recordings and you get more about these stories there. And if you think you're confused now, we have 40 weeks worth archived. You can be confused for hours on end. Hours of endless fun. Watch the snow fall. Okay. So, this is our second story. In the second story, the following is going on. The Jews have now restarted their construction of the temple. They're on the move again. This is unquestionably temple building, at this point not wall building.
Even though they were forbidden?
Right, so it's not clear how the prohibition ended, whether it was actually rescinded, or whether they simply waited a while and then started again. It's unclear. We know that in the second year of King Darius, the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, make a push for the Jews to start building, and they start to build. And then they run into an age-old problem. Zoning issues. There's a governor by the name of Tatnai, who comes into town for a routine visit, and he sees construction going on. And he says, "Excuse me, where's your paperwork?" I'm not kidding. That's what happens. He says, "Do you have a variance? Like, what do you think you're doing?" And they say, in time-honored tradition, "We had it, but we lost it. It was around here somewhere. Give us some time, and we'll find it." Tatnai writes away to headquarters for guidance. Now, there's a whole debate in Jewish sources as to whether we view Tatnai as a bad guy or just someone who's doing his job. Because really, what else would you do if you were the governor and you showed up and they're building a temple and they don't have the right papers in the window? So, Tatnai doesn't stop them from building. But he says, "I'm writing away to headquarters," and he does. And there, they actually find the original document. There's a whole story where they go to one palace and then another palace, but in the end they find the document from Cyrus that licensed us to build. So now take a look at source number 6, which is where we pick up. "Now this is a letter that comes from King Darius / Artachshasta. Now you, Tatnai, governor of the province of beyond the river, Shtar Boznai and colleagues, the officials of the province of beyond the river, stay away from that place. Allow the work of this house of God to go on. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. And I hereby issue an order concerning what you must do to help these elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God. The expenses are to be paid to these men with dispatch out of the resources of the king, derived from the taxes of the province of beyond the river, so that the work not be stopped. You follow? Local tax dollars are going to go for construction of the temple. That's not tax dollars collected from the Jews alone. That's the region. Samaritans are going to be thrilled. They are to be given daily, without fail, whatever they need of young bulls, rams, or lambs as burnt offerings for the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and oil at the order of the priests in Jerusalem, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Okay, self-interest. I also issue an order that whoever alters this decree shall have a beam removed from his house, and he shall be impaled on it. Yes, and his house confiscated. And may the God who established his name there cause the downfall of any king or nation that undertakes to alter or damage that house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have issued the decree. Let it be carried out with dispatch. And of course, that's exactly what happened, and the building progressed. That's your second encounter. Impression of this king at this point?
Very favorable.
Very favorable, generous. He's not only does he say Cyrus ordered it so they can do it, but he's going to fund it out of his own tax collections. Right? This is a good guy. We like this king at this point. And I'm willing to forgive what happened before, because after all, historically we do rebel. Take a look at the third appearance now. The third appearance happens, it's in the next chapter in Ezra. It's right after the temple is built, or 70 years later. It could actually be either one. Again, we're not going to get bogged down in that question, because it doesn't change anything for our purposes. But this is when Ezra shows up. Ezra is a religious leader, student, we are taught, of the scribe who worked for Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the last major prophet in the first temple. Jeremiah himself is unclear whether he goes to Babylon in exile, how long he's in Babylon in exile, but his scribe is a man named Baruch, and Ezra is a student of Baruch. He is a great religious leader who does not show up for the first 6 chapters of the book under his name. The book is called Ezra, but he's not there. Only in chapter 7 do we meet him. King Artachshasta likes Ezra a lot, and he licenses Ezra to go to Judea and to teach and promote Judaism. And look at the powers he gives Ezra. Take a look at source number 7. The following is the text of the letter which King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest scribe, a scholar in matters concerning the commandments of the Lord and his laws to Israel. Ezra is indeed a priest, and he's described in the Hebrew as a sofer. Sofer doesn't have to mean scribe, but that is the way we traditionally look at him. It can also mean teacher of the law. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, scholar in the law of the God of heaven, and so forth. And now, I hereby issue an order that anyone in my kingdom who is of the people of Israel and its priests and Levites who feels impelled to go to Jerusalem may go with you. For you are commissioned by the king and his 7 advisors to regulate Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your care, and to bring the freewill offering of silver and gold which the king and his advisors made to the God of Israel, whose dwelling is in Jerusalem. And whatever silver and gold you find throughout the province of Babylon, together with the freewill offerings the people and the priests will give for the house of their God which is in Jerusalem. All that goes to you. Right? So the king is sending gifts, licensing Ezra to apply and enforce the law of the Jews in the land. Torah is now going to be the law of this land. You shall therefore with dispatch acquire with this money bulls, rams, and lambs, with their meal offerings and libations, and offer them on the altar of the house of your God in Jerusalem. And whatever you wish to do with the leftover silver and gold, you and your kinsmen may do in accord with the will of your God. And the vessels for the service of the house of your God that are given to you, delivered to God in Jerusalem. Any other needs of the house of your God that it falls to you to supply, do so from the royal treasury. But he's not done. I, King Artaxerxes, for my part, hereby issue an order to all the treasurers in the province of beyond the river, that whatever request Ezra the priest, scholar in the law of the God of heaven, makes of you, is to be fulfilled with dispatch, up to the sum of 100 talents of silver, 100 kor of wheat, 100 bat of wine, 100 bat of oil, and salt without limit, kor and bat obviously being volume measures. Whatever is by order of the God of heaven must be carried out diligently for the house of the God of heaven, else wrath will come upon the king and his sons. But he's not done. But wait, there's more. We further advise you that it is not permissible to impose tribute, poll tax, or land tax on any priest, Levite, singer, gatekeeper, temple servant, or other servant of this house of God. Religious exemptions from taxation. And you, Ezra, by the divine wisdom you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to judge all the people in the province of beyond the river who know the laws of your God, and to teach those who do not know them. Let anyone who does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king be punished with dispatch, whether by death, corporal punishment, confiscation of possessions, or imprisonment. Basically, Ezra, you are the emperor. You can kill people. You can enforce the law. You can take the tax dollars and use them for the purpose of your temple. The Dot Mikra edition of Ezra proposes, and I think it's dead on, that what's actually happening here is that the temple is being turned into a Persian government building. Right? Which makes sense as an outgrowth of the policies of Cyrus. Right? That's what you're doing. You're taking this building and giving it the stamp of the Persian Empire. Because Ezra, the religious leader, is an employee of the government now, and is able to access the taxes and is exempt from the taxes like a government worker might be. But everything he does is always going to be under the Persian banner and under the Persian name. It's a very good way to avoid revolt. Right? It makes a lot of sense. It's, we had the, I can't keep track of all the different names. What Maple Leaf Gardens used to be, right? So now it's the Artachshasta Center or the Rogers Center. I get confused.
No, it's a lot.
Sorry? No.
It's Ryerson.
No, that's not. I didn't mean the building. I meant where the Leafs and the Blue Jays play, right? You get all these different names for organizations that sponsor them at some point.
Right, yes.
Right? That's what I'm trying to say. Right? The Arcata Center, the Rogers Center, whatever it is. So you have here the Persian Empire Temple of the Jews. That's what you've succeeded in doing. Artachshasta Arena is what you've created. But that's your third story. Good king or bad king? From a Jewish perspective.
Very good.
We really like him. We like him. We would elect him again and again if there were such thing as democratic elections in the Persian Empire.
He's not getting taxes or anything. They're all going to the temple.
Good question. We have to come back to that. Let's take a look at the fourth story.
And provides this.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Fourth encounter, fourth and last, is the beginning of the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah is an extension of the book of Ezra. In truth, they were one book historically. It was the Christians that started to split it into two different books. Historically, we viewed it for most of history since it was written as one book. You only see Jewish sources start to split it in the late Middle Ages. But in any case, it's the second chapter of what we today call the book of Nehemiah, and this is after Ezra is already in Israel. Nehemiah is a high-ranking servant of King Artachshasta. He's a member of the inner court. He is known as the cupbearer of the king, and he receives word that the Jews in Jerusalem are under attack, and that they don't have a wall to defend the city. Because again, if you follow the chronology straight, leaving aside our first story, they only built the temple, they didn't build the wall of Jerusalem. So, look at what happens. He's upset. He wants to come back and help the Jews. He's a very good administrator. He's going to be very good at building that wall. But take a look at number 8. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, wine was set before him. I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had never been out of sorts in his presence. That's an interesting turn of phrase. The Hebrew is that I was not ra lefanav. I wasn't bad before him. So he's taking the approach that many commentators do. He's saying, I was normally in a good mood when I was with him, and today I wasn't. And therefore, the king said to me, how is it that you look bad, although you are not ill? It must be bad thoughts. Now, bad thoughts are a real problem. If you are an agent serving in the king's court, and particularly if you're the cupbearer, which entails, according to many commentaries, tasting the wine before the king does to make sure that it's kosher? No, to make sure it's safe. So tell me something. What does the king think if you're walking around with a scowl on your face?
No.
That you learned something.
there's a plot, right? That's the assumption, is that there is indeed a plot. So the king says to him, how is it you look bad? It must be bad thoughts. I was very frightened. But I answered the king, may the king live forever. That's a good way to start your response. How should I not look bad when the city of the graveyard of my ancestors lies in ruins and its gates have been consumed by fire? The king said to me, what is your request? With a prayer to the God of heaven, I answered the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor with you, send me to Judah, to the city of my ancestors' graves, to rebuild it. With the consort seated at his side, the king said to me, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it was agreeable to the king to send me. I gave him a date. Then I said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters to the governors of the province of beyond the river, directing them to grant me passage until I reach Judah. Likewise, a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's park, directing him to give me timber for roofing the gatehouses of the temple fortress and the city walls, and for the house I shall occupy. The king gave me these, thanks to my God's benevolent care for me. When I came to the governors of the province of beyond the river, I gave them the king's letters. The king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Good king? Bad king? Excellent. There's nothing not to like about this one, right? That's why I said to you, Artachshasta the good. Right? This is it. What else would you possibly expect of him? Now, in truth, and I'm going quickly because there's so much to cover here, and I apologize for that. I'll stay afterwards also if people want to discuss further. But in truth, you could give multiple motivations for him. You could say that this is a religious motivation. Right? Especially if you take the view that some have, that Darius, who is Artachshasta, is the offspring of Ahasuerus and Esther. Right? So there are those who take that view. But that's a weak view, aside from historical challenges. It's a weak view because I wouldn't have expected that he would do these things then in response to letters and requests. I would have thought he would just go and do, if that was really what was going on. It could be he's not Jewish, but he believes in some value in Judaism. He could be polytheistic. It could be he has a sense of divine mission, like Cyrus, right? As we talked about the possibility with Cyrus. So it could be this is religious. I think it's a little bit hard to sustain. It could be these are political moves. There were localized revolts in this region throughout this period of time. And it could be this is the easiest way to deal with problems is give them what they want. It's cheaper than it's going to cost you to send in troops. So, do this as a way to be politically wise. You could even read this as honor for his predecessors in the Achaemenid dynasty of which he is part. Meaning Cyrus started this, and he views this as tribute to his ancestors. What I want to look at is the way that the sages classically viewed this, playing on a couple of verses within these 4 meetings that we've had with King Artachshasta. Now, looking at the time, I think I'm going to abbreviate the following part. Where I have the calendar here on your sheet, that's the calendar of the Jewish months. I think it will only create confusion if I try to spell out what I was trying to accomplish in the chart and in source number 9. But I'm going to explain it outside of the text. We have a concept of a Jewish New Year. Technically speaking, there should be no Jewish New Year at all. There should be no New Year on the Jewish calendar.
Why?
Because our calendar is lunar, not solar. Right? If you have a solar calendar, it makes sense for there to be a year. It's the point where the Earth is in the same position it was a year ago, going around the sun. Whenever you reach that original point, you can decide whatever you want for what New Year's Day is. But a year is a meaningful term. It's when you've made a complete circuit of the sun. There is no meaning to year if your calendar is lunar. It's just 1 month, another month, another month, another month. It makes no difference. 12 months later, you are not in the same place in respect to the moon. It doesn't change anything. However, the Jewish calendar is also solar because we want certain holidays to come out at certain times of year. We want Pesach to be in the spring and Sukkot to be in the fall. Right? And therefore, we have to adjust our lunar months in order to make sure that certain months will be at certain points in the seasons. And therefore we tie it into the solar year as well. So what we really are is a solar lunar calendar, as opposed to Islam, where it's purely lunar. Right? That's why people get confused, because Ramadan will be in March one year, and then it'll be in January another year, whatever it's going to be. It's going to migrate through the solar calendar, because they don't have any fealty to a solar calendar at all. It's purely lunar. There is no adjustment. In ours, we have the adjustment of the leap year. We try to make everything sync. So we have the concept then of a year, and once you have the concept of a year, that opens up the possibility of saying, this is day one. Day one for us, we are taught, it was the Torah portion a couple of weeks ago, Bo, is the beginning of Nisan. That's why it's listed as the first of the months here, going all the way through Adar in my chart. However, and here's the part that I'm going to abbreviate, the Talmud has different ways of counting for Jewish kings and non-Jewish kings in terms of when the new year is. A Jewish king starts his year the beginning of Nisan, because that's the way it works for Jews. Meaning that, let's say the king took office in August, he's in year one until he gets to the start of Nisan in the spring, and then he starts year two. Even though he has not been king for a full year, that's the completion of a year, and then he starts on year two. Non-Jewish kings start instead in the beginning of Tishrei, what we call Rosh Hashanah. That's when they start. Why is beyond the scope of the discussion right now, but they have a different start date. The problem that we have is that when you look at the verses in the book of Ezra, at one point, this king Artachshasta seems to start a new year when Nisan has passed. And then at another point, he seems to start a new year once Tishrei has passed. At one point, towards the beginning, he seems to be counted as a Jewish king. And then later on in his career, he seems to be counted as a non-Jewish king. This is a translation of source number 9, but again, we're not going there right now. The Talmud's conclusion is, you know what? In the beginning of his reign, he was good. And therefore, we treated him like a Jewish king. Right? Cyrus, Koresh, is kosher. However, at some point, he goes bad. And because he goes bad, we switch the way we're going to count for him in Tanakh. And now he's going to be counting the other way. And that leads the Talmud to try to figure out how we know that he went bad. And the Talmudic passage for this is source number 10. But I'm going to do it outside of the text. I'm going to do it instead by referring to the sources we have already seen here. Jump back into source number 6, please. Source number 6 is when he decrees the funding of the temple. Right? When he tells Tatanai, go ahead with the construction and make sure everything is paid for by the taxes of the whole bit. Right? So he had one line that he threw in there. In the second paragraph of source number 6, the end of the paragraph, he says they are to be given daily without fail bulls, rams, lambs, wheat, salt, wine, oil, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Says the Talmud, aha, he's a selfish king. Sure, he helped us out. Sure, he's funding the temple. But it's because he wants us to pray on his behalf. That's the allegation, right? Who asked it before? It was over Eddie. Did you ask it? What's in it for him? He wants this to be a merit for him. That's the idea. He's dedicating it for him, for his own purposes, for himself. That's one approach in the Talmud. The Talmud then has a problem, because we believe it's okay to do that. As the Talmud notes, we have a tradition. If somebody says, I'm going to give something to tzedakah in the merit that my children should live and be well, we say that person is tzaddik gamur, totally righteous. There's nothing wrong with doing that whatsoever. So what's a big deal if he says, pray for me? So their answer is, it depends on your motivation. Meaning, if you're doing the gift anyway, and you just say, it would be great if the merit would go towards this purpose, that's fine. But if, were you not to get what you wanted, you would be angry that you did the mitzvah in the first place. Why did I bother? Look what bad things happened to me. That's already a bad thing. Then that's what they say is going on with him. That's his motivation. How they have the right to mind read him? This goes back to a much bigger topic in terms of Jews and non-Jews and the nature of covenant. There is a notion that if we participate in the covenant that we accepted at Sinai, right, when we honor that covenant, it's something that we honor not because of self-interest, but because this is who we are, and this is the nation that we are a part of, and of course we will honor it. As opposed to those who have not taken it on, who must be doing this for self-interest and wouldn't do it otherwise. If they really were interested, lishma, altruistically, they would have entered the covenant themselves. And so that's the way that they look at this king. So that's their first attempt to say that he's bad. Then they say, you know what? I have a better attempt. Take a look, and this is in the materials that the instructions that he gives for the building. To actually bring it here. It may not be in the part that I excerpted, in which case I'll just say it outside. No, you know what? It's not in the part that I excerpted. When he talks about building the temple, we also find an added text for the design of the temple, and he orders that they ought to build the temple. Yeah, I didn't bring it here. It's in Ezra 6, chapter 6, sentence 4, which is right before that. But he tells them, I want you to build the temple with 3 layers of hewn stone, and then a layer of cut cedar. Stone, 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 wood. Stone, 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 wood. Says the Talmud, why would you want to have wood layers? What's the purpose of wood in constructing this building?
To hang things on.
Sorry?
To hang things on.
No.
Could burn.
Because it can burn, Marlene says. Because it can burn. In other words, if those Jews ever rebel against me, I can light up the building. That's the idea, says the Talmud. To which they ask, but Solomon did the same thing. If you look at the description in Melachim Aleph in Kings 1, chapter 6, Solomon did the same exact thing. As a matter of fact, we generally assume that was why it was done here, to model it on the first temple. So what's your objection there? Yeah, but the answer, Solomon fireproofed the wood. He lined it with lime. And this king did not. And then they have a third attempt to say that he's bad, which I'm not going to go into. It's on some wording in Nehemiah chapter 2. It's a little bit of an indelicate allegation, and I'd rather just leave it. It's about his family life. And then the fourth one picks up on a verse that we saw in the story where, in source number 7, the bottom of the page, bottom of side 2, in source number 7, where he tells Ezra what he can have for the sacrifices. He said, up to the sum of 100 talents of silver. Up to the sum. In other words, he gives a limit. If you were really a good guy, it would be whatever you need. He said only up to the limit. So the Talmud tries really hard to paint this king, Artachshasta / Darius, in an apparently negative light. Why? What is it, and this is going to take us back to our free will discussion, why is it that we can't just believe that he's a good guy? You could give a technical answer. My calendar issues. Right? The calendar first had him as a Jewish king, then had him as a non-Jewish king. Clearly something must have gone wrong. But I'm sorry. If we really believed he was good, we could find another answer to that problem. There has to be another way to resolve the problem of why he's from Nisan here and he's from Tishrei there, and the Talmud can work that out. Why is it that we need to undermine the idea that he's simply a righteous non-Jew who is benevolent to us?
The temple will go on, maybe he'll turn later on.
Well, by the time you get to the Talmud, he's long gone. Sorry? They don't want Jews to feel any allegiance. Again, he's long gone by the time you get to the Talmud. The Persian Empire is long gone by the time you get to the Talmud. They're dealing with Romans. Yeah, meaning?
Eventually, later on, the rabbis wanted the Jews to believe in God's stuff based on how Jews begin, not on how non-Jews.
Right, so how would this help?
He's a non-Jew.
Right.
They want the loyalty, first and foremost, to be according to the behavior of the Jews.
Right. So, not that we can tell, no.
Right. So, isn't that the
that's a possibility as well. I think I'd say a few points, some of which, what you're saying I think fits into very well. I think to a certain extent it's general cynicism about human leaders. Right? Our first question is, why did he do it? Right? We have a principle, al tivtechu v'nedivim, right? Don't trust princes. And in context in that passage, it means don't trust them because they're mortal, and therefore, even if they help you, they can't help you forever. But there's also the sense of, don't put your faith in them, and this is part of that. I think part of it is not only that he's polytheistic, but the fact that he is Persian. So many of our kings were so rotten that it's embarrassing to think that here you just have a nice guy who did good things. And that can be that may be part of it. Part of it, I think, is that we don't want them. Not only we don't want them to put their faith in this king, but we don't want them to trust the Romans in their day. Right? In their own day. What happens if there was a Roman king, a Roman emperor, in the 4th century, Theodosius, right, who was nicknamed Artachshasta. It was not a friendly nickname that they gave him, because he was considered to be too friendly with the Jews. Maybe from our side, we're afraid that the Jews are going to look to these emperors who we don't really trust. And therefore, we have this need to say, look, even when they look, this is the best non-Jewish king you're going to find. And even he cannot be trusted. He has his own self-interest. He planned to burn the temple if you ever revolted. He was going to limit what he was going to give you. Yeah, I think that's another possible explanation. But I think really what's driving this most is what I brought in the last source on your sheet. Source number 11. 2 different passages. The first one is from when they completed the construction of the temple. They joyfully celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days, for the Lord had given them cause for joy by inclining the heart of the Assyrian king toward them so as to give them support in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. Don't be bothered by the fact that it says Assyrian. He's not Assyrian, he's Persian. But the general assumption is that they often use the name of the area. Like when you conquered an area, they associated you with that area. We find Herodotus does this. He calls the Persian king Babylonian at one point. Don't get hung up on the fact that he's Assyrian. Instead, what you should get hung up on is the Lord had given them cause for joy by inclining the heart of the Assyrian king toward them. Tanakh itself is saying God did it. The next passage here is from when Ezra shows up in Jerusalem, and Ezra says, "Blessed is the Lord God of our fathers, who put into the mind of the king to glorify the house of the Lord in Jerusalem." Right? And who inclined the king and his counselors and the king's military officers to be favorably disposed toward me. And we saw the same idea in chapter 1, sentence 1, regarding Cyrus, when we said, He'ir Hashem et rucho, God awakened his spirit. In other words, the Talmud believes that God is playing a real-world Game of Thrones. That God is manipulating them. They're not naturally good enough to do this, but God aids them. That's the way that it's looked at. And so you can't have Artachshasta the good if we stopped here. But there's one more shoe that has to drop, which is the free will discussion. Look at the kings we've seen and the ways we've seen God deal with them. Darius the Mede does what he does in response to the satraps and advisors around him. How does God deal with this when God does not want Daniel to be eaten by the lions? What did God do? Gives him a miracle. God sends a miracle to save Daniel. What did he not do? He did not change Darius. Well, not punishing him, but he didn't change. He didn't stop him from doing whatever he was going to do. Then you get to Cyrus the Great, who applies his strategy, right, to the rebuilding of the temple. And God awakens his spirit to do it. But we know that Cyrus did it in Babylon. Did God awaken his spirit to do it for Babylon? Right? No. What God does with Cyrus may be to awaken his spirit in terms of helping us, but it's in line with his strategy. It's not as though he's changing what Cyrus does. Cyrus already did it in Babylon. Now he's just doing it for us. Achashverosh the anxious. Right? The actions of the others in that book. Vashti, Bigtan and Teresh, the assassins. Haman, Esther. Their actions trigger his fear, and he acts on the fear. And as seen in the Talmud, God plays with those events, like the story about sending the Malachim into his garden to uproot the trees and blame it on Haman. Right? God does that. But does he change Achashverosh? He's been anxious all along. Fear is part of his personality, and all God does is play on the fear that's already there. The common denominator in all of these stories is that Tanakh depicts God as achieving his ends without needing to alter anyone's personal choices. Whether by using a miracle to counter Darius and his court, whether by strengthening Cyrus's natural strategic inclination that he displayed in Babylon, or whether by presenting Achashverosh with stimuli that he is then going to act on. And the same thing is true with Artachshasta / Darius. Artachshasta has his own motivation for helping us, as the Talmud reads it. Right? He's looking after his family. He thinks this is going to help them. He thinks this is going to help him. He's not a bad guy. When you look at the negative arguments that we saw, I'm skipping argument number 3, because we didn't get into that. But when we look at arguments 1, 2, and 4, what are our negatives? The fact that he wants to pray for his family? The fact that he has a contingency plan in the event that the Jews revolt? I mean, that's what a king does. The fact that there's a cap on the help that he's going to give? None of these paint him as a villain. We have plenty of villains in our history. This would not rank anything in the top 100. This doesn't make him a bad king. What God does is simply strengthen his generous desire, as described here in source number 11, in some undefined way. We don't know what it is that he does to do it. Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, whatever you want to call it. To get him to do that which is going to help us, regardless of his motivations. You follow what I'm suggesting?
So the kings are a means to an end.
The kings are definitely a means to an end, and God's ends are already there, and are going to be fulfilled one way or another. But it's not a matter of changing the king. It's not a matter of saying the king wanted to do X, I'm going to make him do Y. It's a matter of engineering what happens to him in multiple ways. Whether it's by working around him with the miracles with Darius and Daniel, whether it's by presenting the stimuli that are going to lead him in a certain direction, right, as seen in the story with Achashverosh, whether it's simply by boosting his natural strategy, his natural inclination, as seen with Cyrus, and I think with Artachshasta, what God is doing is not changing him. It's simply working with this person's nature and desire, and at times calling in a miracle in order to work around what this person does. And you mentioned Bilam before, right? Someone mentioned Bilam in this area. Okay. But I think Bilam is part of this also, right? The whole story of Bilam and his desire to curse the Jews, and he's going to go do his own thing. Or the story of Paro, if we want to talk kings. And Paro not letting the Jews go, and God playing on his ego so that he will harden his heart and refuse and refuse and refuse. It's all a matter of leading this person where he wants to go anyway. And that's what I see happening in these stories. So what we get out of this, after our 4-week analysis, is that there are multiple levels to this Game of Thrones that's going on. There are the games the kings think they're playing. There are the games that the king's court thinks that they're playing, right? Achashverosh's court, Darius's court, and then there are the games that God is playing, that supersede everything that's going on all the other levels. But all of this is going on in these stories. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I had to monologue so much today, but I'm going to stick around to discuss further. If anyone has to leave, you should please feel free to do so. And again, remember, the next course starts February 21st. I expect to send out the flyer again today in the follow-up email. Thank you. Etty.